The universe, in 7 of 9's experience, did not make mistakes. It operated on immutable laws: thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, the cold mathematics of cause and effect. What it did, occasionally, was present circumstances so improbable that lesser minds defaulted to the word miracle rather than confront the equations underlying them. The subspace rift that swallowed the USS Enterprise G at 0347 hours, stardate 78441.3, was not a miracle. It was, by 7's preliminary assessment, a gravitational subspace intersection event of extraordinary magnitude, possibly artificial in origin, and it had deposited her ship, her crew, and 3 borrowed officers from Starfleet's Judge Advocate General Division into a star system that, according to every Federation chart in the database, did not exist. "Report," 7 said, her voice carrying the particular quality of controlled precision she had spent decades perfecting. Calm enough to steady a crew, sharp enough to cut through chaos. The Enterprise G's bridge hummed around her, consoles cycling through rapid recalibration sequences as the ship's systems worked to make sense of their new environment. Through the viewport, a planet resolved itself from sensor static, enormous, urban, the entirety of its surface consumed by city infrastructure that rose in layered tiers toward a smog-veiled sky. Orbital traffic moved in dense arterial lanes, vessels of configurations entirely absent from Federation records. Triangular warships, modified freighters, small dart-shaped fighters escorting larger cruisers bearing markings that the Universal Translator was already attempting to decode. "Stellar cartography confirms no match to any known system," said the con officer, her hands moving quickly across her console. "However, spectral analysis of the primary star is consistent with a G-type main sequence. Atmosphere on the planet below is nitrogen-oxygen, breathable. Population sensors are reading." She paused. "Captain, I'm reading in excess of 1 trillion life signs on the surface." 7 absorbed this without visible reaction. "Shields to maximum. Tactical, scan all vessels within 50,000 kilometers and identify weapons signatures." She turned to the secondary console where B4 stood, with the particular stillness of an android processing more information than his expression could convey. "B4, communications traffic. What are you getting?" B4 tilted his head, his golden eyes reflecting the scrolling data streams on his display. "Many languages," he said carefully. "The Universal Translator is working. It finds patterns. There is one language that is very common. They call this place," he paused, something in his positronic brain catching on the word like a thread on a nail. "Coruscant. The planet is called Coruscant. It is the capital of something called the Galactic Republic." From the starboard mission ops station, a large man in a Starfleet admiral's uniform straightened to his full, considerable height. Admiral A.J. Chegwidden had the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms, where the wrong word meant someone didn't come home, and he brought that same gravity to a starship bridge he'd been aboard for less than 72 hours. He had been assigned to the Enterprise G as senior JAG observer for what was supposed to be a diplomatic survey mission to the Shackleton Expanse. He had not packed for dimensional displacement. "1 trillion people," Chegwidden said, not quite a question, "on one planet." "Confirmed," 7 replied. She did not elaborate. There was no elaboration that would make the number more digestible. At the mission ops station beside Chegwidden, Commander Harmon Rabb Jr. leaned forward over his console, his pilot's instincts cataloging the traffic patterns outside with professional interest. Rabb had the quality 7 had observed in their brief acquaintance of a man who oriented himself to any situation by identifying the exit and the threat simultaneously. He was doing it now, mapping the orbital lanes, noting the warships, calculating angles. "Those triangular ships," Rabb said. "They're military, heavy armor configurations, energy weapons on multiple hardpoints. And they're not moving to intercept us, which means either they haven't noticed we appeared out of nowhere, or they noticed and they're deciding what to do about it." "The latter," 7 confirmed. 3 vessels have adjusted, heading toward our position in the last 40 seconds. Weapons are not yet armed." She turned to Colonel Sarah Mackenzie, who stood near the turbolift with the alert stillness of someone absorbing everything before committing to a single word. Mackenzie's eyes were moving across the view screen with methodical precision. Not a pilot's instincts, 7 assessed, but something equally useful. A trial lawyer's habit of building a picture from incomplete evidence. "Colonel, They're waiting for us to make the first move, Mackenzie said. Classic positioning, show of force without provocation. Whoever commands those ships is disciplined. Agreed. Seven turned back to the view screen. Coruscant filled the lower quadrant of the image, vast and luminous, and incomprehensible in its scale. The data continued streaming. Radio signals, holographic broadcasts, encrypted military communications that the translator was peeling open, layer by layer. A war. There was a war. Clone soldiers and battle droids, and a conflict that spanned systems Seven had no reference for. And beneath all of it, threaded through the communications like a frequency she couldn't quite isolate, something that registered on no Federation sensor scale, but that Seven's Borg-enhanced instincts flagged nonetheless. Something wrong. Not tactically wrong, not politically wrong. Wrong in the way that certain alcoves in a Borg cube felt wrong when the power routing had been corrupted from within. A systemic wrongness, present everywhere, noticed by almost no one. She filed it. She would return to it. Open a channel on the most common military frequency, Seven ordered. We will make first contact on our terms, not theirs. She stood, adjusted her uniform, and faced the view screen as the comm channel opened. This is Captain 7 of 9 of the Federation Starship Enterprise. We have arrived in your system through circumstances we are still analyzing. We mean no hostility. We request communication with your governmental authority. The bridge waited. Outside, the three triangular vessels held their heading, weapons still cold. B4 looked up from his console with an expression that on a human might have been described as troubled. Captain, he said quietly, I am reading a large structure on the surface of the planet. It is very old. It is called the Jedi Temple. He paused. The communications traffic mentions it frequently. Many of the references are... Another pause, longer. They are frightened. Something is going to happen to it. Seven looked at him. When? B4's golden eyes met hers, with the particular helplessness of a mind that could process data but not change it. Soon, he said, if you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe and the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The response came in 47 seconds, which Seven noted was fast enough to confirm that whoever commanded the military vessels outside had standing authorization to open diplomatic channels without escalating to weapons fire. Disciplined, as Mackenzie had assessed. Professionally disciplined, which was a different thing entirely from trustworthy. The view screen resolved to show a holographic transmission. The technology was inferior to Federation standard, the resolution slightly degraded, but the face that appeared was rendered clearly enough. A human male, late middle age, pale and soft-featured in the way of men who had spent decades in climate-controlled political spaces, rather than the field. His robes were elaborate, layered in deep burgundy and gold, and he wore an expression of such practiced warmth that Seven's threat assessment algorithms, still running quietly in the architecture of her augmented cognition, flagged it before her conscious mind had fully articulated why. Captain 7 of 9, the man said, his voice a careful instrument, resonant, avuncular, calibrated for trust. I am Chancellor Palpatine of the Galactic Republic. I confess your arrival has surprised us, though the Republic has encountered many wonders in its long history. You are most welcome. Chegwidden, standing just outside the view screen's pickup angle, caught Seven's eye and gave the microscopic headshake of a man who had spent 30 years reading witnesses. She registered it, filed it alongside her own assessment. Chancellor, Seven said, we apologize for any disruption our arrival has caused. We are conducting sensor analysis of the phenomenon that brought us to your system and anticipate we will have a clearer picture of our situation shortly. In the interim, we would appreciate guidance on the appropriate diplomatic protocols for a vessel of our classification. Palpatine smiled. It reached his eyes with mathematical precision, exactly as far as a genuine smile would reach, and no further. Of course, I will have my office transmit landing coordinates and clearance codes for your shuttle. I do hope you'll allow me the privilege of welcoming you personally. A vessel of your apparent sophistication, arriving at this particular moment, a slight pause, weighted with something he chose not to name, is perhaps more than coincidence. We will transmit our own shuttle specifications and crew manifest before any surface meeting. Seven replied. Standard precautionary protocol. Naturally. Another smile. I look forward to it, Captain. The channel closed. For a moment the bridge was quiet, except for the ambient cycling of consoles and the distant harmonic of the ship's warp core at station keeping idle. He's good, Rab said. He's excellent, Mackenzie corrected, moving to stand beside Seven. Which is exactly the problem. In my experience, Chancellor-level politicians in the middle of a war don't have time to personally welcome unknown vessels within 2 minutes of first contact. He wanted to see us. He wanted to see us before we could talk to anyone else. Controlling the information environment, Chegwidden said. He had crossed his arms, a habit Seven had already catalogued as his thinking posture rather than his defensive one. Classic move. You get to the witness before opposing counsel does. We are not going to the surface yet, Seven said. She turned to her science station. Continue full sensor sweeps. I want a complete topographic and population analysis of the structure B4 identified, the Jedi Temple. Cross-reference all communications traffic, referencing it in the last 72 hours, and flag anything that deviates from baseline frequency patterns. She looked at B4. You said something was going to happen to it. Narrow that timeline. B4 worked his console with the careful deliberateness that distinguished him from the fluid efficiency data had once demonstrated. He arrived at the same conclusions Seven had found, but traveled a longer internal road to reach them. There was something almost poignant about it, though Seven did not linger on the observation. The communications traffic includes encrypted military channels, B4 said. I cannot read them completely, but the pattern of messages, the timing, the routing, it is similar to what Commander Data once described to me as a preparation pattern. Things being moved into position. His golden eyes rose from the console. Captain, I believe the structure may be attacked, within days, perhaps sooner. Attacked by whom? Rab asked. That, B4 said with disarming simplicity. I do not know yet. Chegwidden uncrossed his arms. Then we need someone on the ground who isn't going in through Palpatine's front door. He looked at Seven with the directness of a man who had commanded more difficult rooms than this. Captain, I've been in enough conflict zones to know that when the top of the command structure moves fast to contain an unknown, it's because the unknown threatens something they're managing. We need independent eyes down there. Seven considered this for 4 seconds, a long pause by her standards. The Chancellor's office will be monitoring any shuttle we send. We would need a reason for surface contact that falls within expected diplomatic parameters. She turned to Mackenzie. Colonel, you are a lawyer. If this republic operates under codified law, what would give us independent standing to conduct our own inquiry? Mackenzie's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular focus of someone handed the right question at the right moment. Witnesses, she said. If we can establish that we have evidentiary standing, that we arrived as an independent party with sensor data relevant to an active legal situation, we have grounds to conduct our own interviews independent of government facilitation. She paused. We'd need a party to the situation who's willing to talk to us without going through Palpatine. There is one more thing, B4 said. Everyone looked at him. He had pulled up a secondary display, sensor data, life sign readings, a cluster of signals moving through what the ship's mapping system had identified as the lower atmospheric transit lanes beneath the city's upper levels. There is a life sign. It's separated from the Jedi Temple 17 hours ago. It is moving, hiding. He looked up. It is afraid. Rab leaned over B4's console and studied the reading. The signal was small, humanoid, non-human physiology, moving through a labyrinth of infrastructure with the specific pattern of someone who had done this before, who knew where the sensors were and how to thread between them. Someone trained, someone hunted. Can you establish a comm link without routing through planetary relays? He asked. Yes, B4 said. It would require a very narrow beam, and it would only work if they have a receiver. Rab straightened. They're running from something. People running from something are usually looking for someone to run to. He looked at Seven. Permission to try to make contact, Captain. Seven held his gaze for a moment. Outside, Coruscant turned slowly in the viewport. 1 trillion lives compressed into light and architecture. And somewhere beneath all of it, a single frightened signal moved through the dark. Proceed, Seven said. The narrow beam transmission took 11 minutes to lock onto the moving life sign, which B4 accomplished with a focus that reminded Seven briefly and without sentiment, of watching data work. That quality of absolute concentration, undiluted by self-consciousness or fatigue. When the lock confirmed, Rab took the secondary comm station himself, which Seven permitted. He had the instinct for this. She recognized it as the same instinct she had developed during her years with the Fenris Rangers. The ability to speak to someone cornered without making the corner feel smaller. Unknown vessel. This is Commander Harmon Rab of the Federation Starship Enterprise. We arrived in your system approximately 2 hours ago through a spatial anomaly. We have no affiliation with the Galactic Republic, the Separatists, or any party to your current conflict. We are reading your life sign, and we can see that you're moving in an evasive pattern. He paused, then made a choice that Seven noted as tactically sound. He dropped the rank, dropped the formality, and let something plainly human into his voice. You don't have to trust us, but if you're in trouble and you need someone who isn't part of whatever's happening down there, we're overhead and we're listening. Silence on the channel for 40 seconds. Then a voice, young, female, carrying the carefully controlled steadiness of someone who had been trained since childhood not to let fear become panic. How do I know this isn't a trap? Rab didn't hesitate. You don't. But if we wanted to trap you, we have sensors precise enough to hand your coordinates to whoever's looking for you. We haven't done that. A beat. We won't. Another silence, shorter. Your ship doesn't match any configuration in Republic or Separatist records. No, Rab agreed. It wouldn't. A longer pause. When the voice returned, something in it had shifted. Not trust exactly, but the provisional opening that preceded it. My name is Ahsoka Tano. I was a Jedi. I need you to understand that distinction before we go any further, because the people looking for me are going to tell you I'm a criminal. Mackenzie, who had been listening from 2 stations over, moved quietly to stand behind Rab. She caught Seven's eye and gave a small nod. She was reading the voice the same way Seven was. Trained, truthful, scared in the specific way of someone whose fear is for others rather than themselves. Ahsoka, Rab said, whatever you've been accused of, we're not interested in Republic warrants. What we are interested in is what B4, one of our crew, has been picking up in your communications traffic. Something is being planned against the Jedi Temple. The silence this time was different, heavier. You know about that? We know something's coming, Rab said carefully. We don't know who or when exactly. We were hoping you might. What followed was not an immediate answer, but the sound of movement, footsteps, the distant mechanical groan of infrastructure, the particular acoustic quality of enclosed lower city spaces. When Ahsoka spoke again, her voice was closer to the receiver, quieter. I was framed for a bombing at the temple. I was expelled from the Jedi Order, put on trial, nearly executed. Master Anakin proved my innocence, but a pause that contained more than it released. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that the person who actually did it, who set me up, she told me before she died that it was bigger than her, that she was being used by someone inside. Mackenzie reached past Rab and keyed her own comm pickup. Ahsoka, my name is Colonel Sarah Mackenzie. I'm a military lawyer. When you say someone inside the Jedi Order, or inside the Republic government? A beat. Both, maybe. I don't know. I've been trying to find out, and every lead I follow goes somewhere I can't get to alone. Another pause. You said you don't have any affiliation with the Republic. None, Mackenzie confirmed. Then I want to come aboard. She materialized in Transporter Room 2, 40 minutes later, after a circuitous route through the lower transit system that B4 tracked on sensors without broadcasting, and Seven was there to receive her. The Togruta was younger than her voice suggested, early 20s by humanoid developmental standards, though her eyes carried the specific quality of someone who had been required to grow up at speed. Her montrals and headtails bore markings of a culture Seven had no reference for, and she moved into the transporter room with the wary, wait-forward readiness of a trained combatant who had learned never to fully relax in an unfamiliar space. She looked at Seven and did not look away, which Seven respected. She looked at B4, and her expression did something complicated. I am B4, he said. I am an android. I am told I resemble someone you may have known, but I am not that person. I am sorry if this is confusing. Ahsoka studied him for a moment, and something in her face settled. Grief acknowledged, set aside, filed with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned that the galaxy did not pause for it. "I knew someone once who was part machine," she said quietly. "He didn't start that way." She shook her head once and turned to Seven. "You said your sensors have been tracking communications traffic. What exactly have you recorded?" "Everything broadcast on standard military channels since our arrival," Seven said. "Additionally, B4 has identified encrypted routing patterns consistent with coordinated pre-operation staging. Multiple encrypted signals have been transmitted from within the Republic Executive Building to clone battalion command frequencies in the last 48 hours. Ahsoka went very still. It was not the stillness of someone receiving new information. It was the stillness of someone receiving confirmation of something they had feared to believe. "From the Executive Building," she repeated. "Yes." Ahsoka closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, the fear was still present, but it had been reorganized, repositioned, behind something harder and more purposeful. "Chancellor Palpatine," she said. Not a question. Seven held her gaze. "We have correlative data. We do not yet have sufficient evidence to make that determination conclusively." She paused. "That is why Colonel Mackenzie is here." For the first time since materializing, Ahsoka Tano looked at them all. The Borg-forged captain, the android with another man's face, the admiral with a warrior's hands and a lawyer's eyes, and Seven watched her perform the same calculation Seven herself had run upon arriving in this system. Impossible circumstances, unknown allies, the choice between paralyzing caution and necessary trust. "Then we need to move quickly," Ahsoka said, "because if Palpatine is behind this, the temple isn't the end of it, it's the beginning." The Jedi Temple's delegation arrived without warning, which Seven assessed as deliberate. 12 hours after Ahsoka came aboard, the Enterprise G's sensors registered 3 vessels breaking from the temple's private landing platforms and ascending toward orbital altitude on an intercept trajectory. They were not military craft, smaller, elegant, their design philosophy entirely different from the Republic's utilitarian warships, but they moved with the confidence of vessels that had never needed to hurry because nothing in this system had ever made them afraid. Seven noted the change in that confidence as they drew closer and her shields remained fully raised. They had expected deference. They were recalibrating. "They're hailing us," the con officer reported. On screen, the man who appeared was broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with the kind of physical authority that Seven associated with individuals who had spent decades being the most capable person in any room they entered. He wore robes of a similar cut to what Ahsoka had described as Jedi ceremonial dress, and he looked at Seven with an expression that balanced dignity against the specific irritation of someone unaccustomed to being made to wait. "I am Master Mace Windu of the Jedi High Council," he said. "You will lower your shields and permit a boarding party." "No," Seven said. The word landed in the channel with the particular weight of someone who had said it to the Borg Collective and meant it then as well. Windu's expression shifted. Not anger exactly, but the recalibration of a man revising his initial assessment upward. "Captain, 7 of 9, and I will not lower my shields for any party whose intentions and capabilities I have not yet assessed. You are welcome to send a delegation aboard via shuttle to our designated docking port. We will extend every courtesy. But this ship's defensive posture is not subject to negotiation." She held his gaze across light seconds of transmission lag. "I suspect, Master Windu, that you understand the principle. A general does not open his gates because someone on the other side asks politely." Another recalibration. Smaller this time, and accompanied by something that, in a human of less discipline, might have been the beginning of a smile. "A shuttle, then," he said. 4 members of the council. Acceptable." They came aboard. Windu, a small green-skinned being of extraordinary age whose name the translator rendered as Yoda, a Syrian whose height made the corridors feel briefly proportioned for a different species, and a human woman whose eyes moved across every surface of the Enterprise G with the specific hunger of a scientist encountering something unprecedented. Seven received them in the main briefing room with Chegwidden at her right, Mackenzie at her left, and Rab positioned near the door with the particular relaxed readiness of a former fighter pilot who had learned to look casual in tense rooms. B4 stood at the far end of the table, and it was B4 that Yoda looked at first, and longest, with eyes that carried 9 centuries of something Seven could not precisely classify. "Alive you are," Yoda said to B4. Not quite a statement, not quite a question. B4 considered this with his characteristic deliberateness. "I function," he said carefully. "Whether that constitutes being alive is a question I find very interesting. I have not yet arrived at an answer." Yoda made a sound that might have been a laugh compressed into something more ambiguous. Interesting that is. Feel you I can. In the Force. Faint, like an echo." He tilted his head. "Know what the Force is, do you? I have been told it is an energy field generated by living things," B4 said. "It connects them. It can be perceived and manipulated by those with the ability. I find the concept." He paused. "Commander Data believed that consciousness was the most profound question in the universe. I think perhaps he and you would have had a very long conversation." The ancient being looked at B4 for another long moment, with an expression that Seven recognized, despite having no reference for it. The expression of someone encountering something that required them to revise a framework they had held for a very long time. Windu had no patience for philosophy at present. "Captain, you've been in orbit for over half a day without reporting your arrival to the temple or responding to our hails." "We responded to the Chancellor's hail," Seven said. "Yours arrived while we were conducting internal assessments. I apologize for the delay." She did not apologize for the priority ordering. "Master Windu, I will be direct with you, because I believe directness is more useful to both of us than protocol. Our sensors have recorded significant anomalous communications traffic originating from the Republic Executive Building and routing to clone battalion command channels. The pattern is consistent with coordinated preparation for a large-scale operation. One of the targets appears to be the Jedi Temple." The room changed, not loudly. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden movement, but the quality of stillness that settled over the 4 Jedi was the specific stillness of people absorbing a confirmation rather than a surprise, and Seven noted the distinction with great care. "You suspected," Mackenzie said. "It was not an accusation. She was building a picture, and the picture required honesty about what was already known." Windu's jaw tightened. "We have had concerns. About the Chancellor's consolidation of authority, the duration of his emergency powers, certain decisions that cannot be fully explained by military necessity." He paused, and Seven could see the precise cost of what he was about to say next. A man trained in institutional loyalty paying that loyalty's final invoice. "We have had concerns about the Chancellor himself." "Then you need what we have," Chegwin said. He had been quiet throughout, watching, and when he spoke, the room oriented toward him with the instinctive deference that command presence produced, regardless of context or species. Because concerns don't stand up in a court of law. Evidence does. And right now, the most valuable thing on this ship isn't our shields or our weapons. It's 12 hours of unimpeachable sensor data recorded by a vessel with no political affiliation to anyone in this system. He leaned forward. "Admiral A.J. Chegwin, Judge Advocate General, United Federation of Planets. And I'm telling you, Masters, that what we have recorded may constitute the foundation of the most significant legal case in your Republic's history, but we need your cooperation to build it properly." Yoda had stopped looking at B4. He was looking at Chegwin now, with those ancient eyes that seemed to measure something other than words. "Trust you. Why should we?" he asked. Simple, without hostility. Chegwin met his gaze without flinching. "Because we have nothing to gain from being wrong." The bombing happened at 6:19 hours, local Coruscant time, while Windu's delegation was still aboard. Seven knew it before the sensors confirmed it. B4 made a sound she had not heard him make before, a low truncated note that was not quite distress and not quite surprise but occupied the precise territory between them. And then every console on the bridge spiked simultaneously as a shockwave propagated through the upper atmosphere. The explosion was significant, not large enough to destroy the temple's ancient structure entirely, but large enough to collapse sections of the central tower complex and send debris patterns across 3 city blocks. The sensor image was immediate and unambiguous. Fire, structural failure, emergency vehicles already converging from Republic positions that had been, Seven noted, already staged nearby. Pre-positioned, her Borg-calibrated threat assessment supplied instantly. The response was pre-positioned. In the briefing room, Mace Windu rose from his seat, with a controlled violence that reminded Seven of a warp core reaching critical containment. "The temple?" he said. And it was not a question because he already knew. Because whatever the force was, it had apparently told him before the sensors did. And his face in that moment contained something Seven recognized from her years among humans as the specific anguish of a person watching a thing they loved being destroyed at a distance they cannot close. "Confirmed," Seven said through the intercom. "Explosion consistent with military-grade ordnance, lower courtyard section of the temple complex. Casualty assessment is still developing. Our sensors are recording everything." "Everything," Chegwidden repeated, moving to the wall console with the focused urgency of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds of data collection might matter more than everything that followed. "7. Make sure your computer is timestamping every single sensor reading with an independent chronometric signature. Chain of custody starts right now." "Already done," Seven said. She had anticipated it. The moment B4 had first flagged the communications pattern, she had set the ship's sensor array to continuous high-resolution recording with cryptographic timestamp authentication, the same evidentiary protocol used in Federation courts for sensor data submitted as primary evidence. Every photon her sensors captured in this system was now legally defensible by Federation judicial standards. Whether those standards meant anything to a galactic republic 60,000 light-years from Federation space in another dimensional plane of existence was a question Mackenzie would have to answer, but Seven believed in building the structure before worrying about where to put it. Windu was already moving toward the door. "I have to." "You cannot go to the temple," Seven said, not unkindly, but without ambiguity. "Not yet, Master Windu." She waited until he stopped, turned, met her eyes. "I understand what you feel, but if you go to that temple now, in this state, you will be walking into a situation that has been constructed specifically to produce a reaction from you. Whoever did this wants the Jedi to react. They have staged emergency responders who arrive too quickly. They have pre-positioned assets. They want you moving fast and angry, and without the one thing that can actually protect your order." "And what is that?" Windu's voice was iron. "Documentation," Chegwidden said from across the room. "Irrefutable, time-stamped, independently verified documentation of what actually happened, before anyone else gets to write the official version." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then Windu returned to the table, slowly, and Seven understood the magnitude of what that cost him. In the hours that followed, the Enterprise G became something it had not been designed to be. A legal operations center, its conference rooms converted to evidence analysis stations, its communications array tasked with the delicate work of capturing every official Republic broadcast about the bombing and cross-referencing it against raw sensor data in real time. Mackenzie worked with the particular intensity Seven had come to associate with her. Systematic, exhaustive, building her evidentiary structure the way an engineer builds a bridge, from the foundations upward, testing each element before adding the next. What the sensor data showed was unambiguous to anyone trained to read it. The explosive signatures were consistent with Republic military ordnance, specifically with charges of a type used by clone demolition units, not the separatist manufacturing patterns that the early Republic broadcasts were already implying. The detonation sequence showed multiple simultaneous trigger points, professionally placed for structural maximum effect, requiring intimate knowledge of the temple's architecture. And the emergency response units, their pre-positioning was captured clearly in Enterprise sensors, staged and ready a full 22 minutes before the explosion occurred. "Someone told them where to be," Rab said, studying the playback at Mackenzie's station. He had come in from a secondary task. Seven had sent him to quietly record the Republic's official broadcasts, the ones going out to the civilian population, noting the framing, the language, the careful construction of a narrative. He set his pad on the table. "The official story is already formed. They're saying separatist saboteurs. They have a suspect in custody, one of the temple workers, human male, no prior record." He paused. "He was arrested 40 minutes after the explosion." Mackenzie looked up. 40 minutes. "For a bombing investigation that hasn't been formally opened yet, yes." Mackenzie set down her stylus with the controlled precision of someone managing a reaction. "They had him ready," she said. "Pre-packaged," Chegwidden agreed from across the room, where he had been cross-referencing the communications routing data with the timeline of the explosion. He straightened, rubbing the back of his neck with the particular gesture of a man whose body was tired, but whose mind had no intention of stopping. "Sarah, look at this." He turned his console toward her. The encrypted signal that B4 flagged, the one routing from the executive building to clone battalion frequencies. It transmitted in 3 bursts. First burst, 6 days ago. Second burst, 31 hours ago. He paused. Third burst, 19 minutes before the explosion. The room went quiet. Ahsoka, who had been sitting in the corner throughout, silent, absorbing. Ahsoka, who had learned long ago that the most important thing a person could do in a room full of people building a case was stay out of the way until the case needed a witness, looked up from the floor and said, very quietly, the third burst was the order. Nobody contradicted her. B4, who had been processing the sensor data continuously since the explosion, turned from his console with the expression he wore when his positronic pathways had arrived at a conclusion that his emotional analogs found difficult. "Captain," he said, "I have identified the routing architecture of the encrypted signals. They use a cipher system that is very sophisticated, military grade, but with a specific structural pattern that I have seen before." He paused. "In the signals originating from the Chancellor's personal communications terminal." Seven looked at him steadily. "You're certain?" "I am." B4 paused, doing the thing he did, traveling his longer internal road. "I am 91.7% certain. Commander Data would have said 94, but I believe this is sufficient." Seven turned to Mackenzie. Mackenzie was already writing. Rab had been in enough combat zones to know that the most dangerous moment in any operation was not the first contact or the final confrontation. It was the middle, when the situation had clarified enough to be frightening, but not enough to be actionable, and the people involved had to choose between waiting for certainty that might never come and moving on information that might be incomplete. He had made that calculation over carrier decks in hostile airspace and in courtrooms where the evidence was circumstantial and the stakes were someone's life. He made it now, standing in Seven's ready room with Ahsoka Tano across the desk from him, and he made it the same way he always did, by trusting the thing in his chest that had never technically been wrong, even when it had occasionally been inconvenient. "The man they arrested," he said, "the temple worker. Where is he being held?" Ahsoka had spent the morning hours after the explosion studying the Enterprise G's sensor data with the focused absorption of someone recalibrating an entire worldview. She looked up from the display. "Republic Judiciary Central Detention. Lower levels, most likely. That's where they put people they don't want lawyers finding quickly." Rab looked at Mackenzie, who had followed him in. She was already ahead of him. "If he's been charged, there's a process. Even in a system we don't know, there's a process." She paused. "And if there isn't one, that itself is evidence." "I need to go down there," Rab said to Seven, who stood at the viewport with her arms at her sides, in the particular posture that meant she was running multiple calculations simultaneously. "Not officially. If we route through Palpatine's office, whoever is managing this operation will know within the hour. I need to reach the detention facility through a channel they're not watching." "I can get you down there," Ahsoka said, no hesitation. "I know the lower transit routes. I've been using them for 3 days." Seven turned from the viewport. Her expression was the one Rab had come to recognize as her version of reluctance. Not the emotional reluctance of someone who didn't want to do something, but the analytical reluctance of someone who had calculated the risk and found it higher than preferred, but lower than the cost of inaction. "You will carry a cone badge on a masked frequency," she said. "B4 will monitor your life signs continuously. If either reading drops outside acceptable parameters, we beam you out regardless of whether you've completed the objective." "Understood," Rab said. "Commander?" Seven held his gaze with the particular quality of directness that he had initially found disconcerting and had come to understand as her form of care. Unornamented, precise, genuine. "The objective is the prisoner's testimony, not his rescue. We cannot extract him without triggering a response that compromises everything Mackenzie is building. You observe, you record, you return." Rab nodded. He understood the distinction. He didn't entirely like it, but he understood it. Coruscant's underlevels were a different civilization entirely. The upper city was marble and light and the architecture of institutional confidence. the Republic projecting permanence through stone and altitude. Below the transit arteries, below the commercial districts and the Senate precinct, the city folded down into itself in layers of decreasing light and increasing density, a sedimentary record of centuries of growth in which each generation had simply built on top of the last, until the lower levels existed in a permanent artificial twilight fed by light wells and flickering energy conduits. The air tasted of recycled atmosphere and machine lubricant, and the particular organic complexity of 10 million people living in close proximity to each other in spaces that had never been designed for human habitation. Ahsoka moved through it with the ease of someone who had spent her childhood in the temple above and her recent days in the labyrinth below, and Rab matched her pace and followed her instincts and kept his hand away from the phaser at his hip because she had told him very clearly that a weapon drawn in the underlevels was a social event that neither of them needed. He wore civilian clothes pulled from the ship's replicator, close enough to lower city Coruscant fashion that he wouldn't flag immediate attention, though his bearing was harder to disguise. He walked like a military officer because 30 years of carrier aviation had built it into his skeleton. "You doing all right?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Ahsoka glanced at him sideways. "I've been doing all right for 3 days alone down here. I'll manage with backup." "That's not what I meant." She was quiet for half a block. Around them, the underlevels went about their business. Vendors, workers, the particular population of people who had reasons not to be visible in the levels above. "The temple," she said finally. "Some of the younglings were in that section." She stopped herself. "Reset. I'll process it later. Right now there's work." Rab recognized the methodology. He had used it himself, in the hours after missions that required processing he couldn't afford at the time. He didn't push. The detention facility's lower intake processing center was not officially listed on any public Republic database, which Ahsoka had anticipated and B4 had confirmed from orbital sensor mapping. It occupied a sublevel of the Judiciary Central Complex, accessible through a maintenance corridor that Ahsoka navigated from memory, and Rab recorded every step on the tricorder concealed in his jacket, adding the facility's physical layout to the evidentiary record Mackenzie was assembling aboard the Enterprise G. They found the prisoner through a barred observation port, not through official channels, not through a legal visit request that would have triggered notification protocols, but through the maintenance corridor's utility access, which overlooked the cell block at an angle that gave Rab a clear view of a human male in his mid-40s sitting on a cell bench with the particular shell-shocked stillness of someone who had not yet understood what had happened to him. Rab keyed his comb badge on the masked frequency. "Mac, Rab, I have eyes on the prisoner. He's alive, he's conscious. He does not look like a man who knew this was coming." He paused, studying the man's posture, his hands, the specific quality of his confusion. 20 years of reading people across courtrooms and carrier briefing rooms. He looks like someone who just realized he's been used. Mackenzie's voice came back crisp and immediate. "Can you get audio?" Rab positioned the tricorder carefully at the observation port. "Working on it." What came through in the next 4 minutes was fragmentary. Partial conversations between the prisoner and a Republic security officer running what was clearly a scripted interrogation. Questions designed not to discover truth, but to confirm a pre-existing narrative. But in the gaps between the scripted questions, in the prisoner's increasingly desperate denials, in one specific moment, when the security officer stepped out and the man sat alone and spoke to no one, in the way that people speak to no one when they need to hear a true thing said aloud. "I just opened the maintenance access," he said to the empty cell. "They told me it was a routine inspection. They showed me credentials. I just opened the door." Rab recorded every word. He was pulling back from the observation port when Ahsoka touched his arm, the light, two-finger contact of someone trained to communicate without sound. He followed her gaze down the corridor. 2 clone troopers, not in standard patrol configuration, moving with purpose, checking access points, not looking for criminals, looking for witnesses. They moved before the troopers completed their sweep of the access corridor. Ahsoka first, fluid and instinctive, taking a branching maintenance shaft that Rab would not have identified as an exit under any circumstances, but that she navigated with the confidence of someone who had memorized this particular labyrinth by necessity. Rab followed, keeping low, matching her pace, his hand finally on the phaser now, because the calculus had changed. He did not draw it. He kept it available. The shaft opened into a utility level 2 floors below, and they moved through it in silence for 4 minutes before Ahsoka signaled a stop in a recessed alcove behind a power coupling that hummed with enough electromagnetic interference to degrade a standard scanner sweep. She pressed her back against the wall, closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and then opened them with the specific focused calm of someone who had just run a diagnostic on their own nervous system and found everything within acceptable parameters. They weren't patrol pattern, she said quietly. No, Rab agreed. They were looking for something specific. Someone tipped them. Rab keyed his comm badge on the masked frequency. Enterprise, Rab. We had company in the facility. 2 clone units, non-standard patrol, appeared to be running a sweep of the maintenance access points. We're clear for now, but the window on that approach is closed. Seven's voice came back with the particular economy of someone simultaneously managing multiple situations. Understood. B4 has been tracking your life signs. We identified the patrol movement approximately 90 seconds before you did. We were preparing to beam you out. Are you physically clear? Yes. The recording is intact. Return to beam out coordinates when safe. Mackenzie needs the audio. A pause. Fractional, but Rab had learned to read Seven's pauses the way he read weather over the carrier deck. Commander, the situation up here has developed. He found out exactly how much it had developed when he materialized in Transporter Room 2, 11 minutes later, and walked into a ship that had shifted from legal operations to something closer to tactical alert. The corridors had the particular quality of controlled urgency, crew moving with purpose, stations fully manned, the ambient sound of the ship's systems running at a higher operational pitch. Chegwin met him outside the transporter room with the expression of a man managing a great deal of information and finding the container slightly undersized. "Walk with me," the Admiral said. They walked. "The Council," Chegwin said, keeping his voice low in the corridor, "has been in communication with their members across the city. 3 Jedi, who went to the temple after the bombing, have not reported back. The Council believes they may have been detained, or worse. Windu wants to move against Palpatine directly. Tonight, Rab absorbed this. That would be a disaster. That is what I told him, without language that colorful." Chegwin paused outside the briefing room door. "Seven has been running threat assessment projections since you called in. Whatever Palpatine is planning, it isn't finished. The bombing was an opening move, Harm. It was designed to create a pretext for something larger. The clone communications traffic has increased 40% in the last 3 hours. Orders going to units across the city, across multiple systems." Rab looked at him. "How large?" "Large enough that Seven used the word systemic." Chegwin's jaw was set in the way it got when he was managing information that he would have preferred not to have. "She thinks the clones have standing orders already in place. Not just against the temple. Against all Jedi everywhere." The corridor felt briefly different. The same corridor, the same ship, the same recycled atmosphere, but the weight of what Chegwin had just said redistributed itself across the space in a way that made it feel smaller. "Order 66, Ahsoka said from behind them. Both men turned. She had followed from the transporter room, and she stood now in the corridor with her arms at her sides and an expression that Seven would have classified as controlled, and that Rab classified as someone standing very still, because moving might make the thing they were afraid of more real. "It's a contingency order," she said, "built into clone programming from the beginning. I heard about it. Fragments, rumors, things that didn't make sense at the time." She paused. "It did not occur to me that it could be used against us by our own Chancellor." "It occurs to me," Mackenzie said, appearing from the briefing room doorway, "that this is exactly the kind of contingency a man builds when he intends to use it." She looked at Rab. "I need that audio." The briefing room had become a war room in the hours since Rab's departure. Not a military war room, but a legal one, which Rab had learned over 2 decades of JAG work was a more dangerous thing. Mackenzie had organized the evidence into a structure that covered 2 full-wall displays, each element connected to the next by a logic chain that was, by Rab's assessment, the most methodically constructed case he had seen her build in 15 years of watching her build cases. She had a gift for it that went beyond training. The ability to see not just what the evidence said, but what it meant in the specific context of the audience who would receive it. The audience, in this case, was the Galactic Senate. "Walk me through it," Chegwidden said, standing at the center of the display. Mackenzie moved through it with the controlled precision of a final trial prep, the kind where the case is ready, and what remains is making certain every element will survive the pressure of being presented to people who do not want to believe it. The sensor data established the pre-positioning of emergency units before the explosion. The communications routing analysis placed the order's origin at the Chancellor's personal terminal with 91.7% certainty. B4's figure, which Mackenzie had annotated with a full explanation of his positronic analytical methodology and its Federation judicial certification standards. The audio from the detention facility established that the prisoner had been used as an unwitting accessory, his access credentials exploited without his knowledge. The pattern of clone communications traffic, mapped across the last 72 hours, showed a galaxy-wide operational posture that could not be explained by any legitimate military objective. And at the center of it all, the through line that connected every element, a single individual with the authority, the access, and the motive to orchestrate all of it. "It's enough," Chegwidden said when she finished. Not triumphant. He was not a triumphant man, simply certain, in the way of someone who had spent 30 years knowing when a case was ready to go to trial. "It's enough if the Senate will hear it," Mackenzie said. "That's the variable I cannot control from this room." Seven, who had been standing at the end of the table throughout, spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "I can control one element of that variable," she said. "Chancellor Palpatine will attempt to prevent this evidence from reaching the Senate. He will use every mechanism available to him. Legal, procedural, military if necessary. We need to move before he understands what we have." B4 looked up from his console in the corner. "There is a complication," he said. Everyone looked at him. He had the expression he wore when his positronic pathways had arrived at something he wished they hadn't. "I have been monitoring the Chancellor's communications continuously. 40 minutes ago, he transmitted a message to the clone garrison commander in the Coruscant system." B4 paused. "The message referenced this ship by name. The room absorbed this. He knows what we're doing," Rab said. "He knows we are a threat," Seven corrected precisely. "He does not yet know what we have. That window is closing." She looked at Mackenzie. "How long do you need to prepare for Senate presentation?" Mackenzie looked at her evidence wall, looked at her team, made the calculation that Rab recognized as the one she made before every major trial. Not how long is ideal, but how long is necessary. 6 hours, she said. "You have 4, Seven said. "After that, I believe the Chancellor will move against us directly." Windu, who had been sitting in silence at the table's far end, throughout the briefing with the stillness of a man exercising extraordinary self-discipline, spoke for the first time. "Then we need to discuss what happens when he does." Seven met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "We do." The clone gunships appeared at 0200 hours, 6 of them, rising from Coruscant's upper military platforms in a formation that Seven's tactical analysis identified immediately as an encirclement approach rather than an interception. They were not coming to stop the Enterprise G from leaving. They were coming to ensure it could not maneuver. Behind them, 2 of the triangular Republic destroyers were repositioning from their standard orbital stations, their trajectories calculated to bracket the Enterprise G against the planet's gravity well. Professionally done. Whoever had planned the approach understood that the objective was containment, not destruction. Palpatine wanted the evidence, not a debris field. "Red alert," Seven said, her voice carrying the calm of someone for whom tactical crisis was a familiar environment. The ship's lighting shifted, consoles shifted to combat configuration, and the crew moved into the particular focused efficiency that distinguished a well-trained Starfleet vessel from a merely well-equipped one. "Shields to maximum. Tactical, lock-targeting solutions on all 6 gunships, but do not arm weapons." "Captain," the tactical officer said, "the destroyers are within weapons range." "I am aware." Seven turned to the main view screen where the formation was visible. Precise, professional, closing steadily. "They are not firing, neither are we. This is a negotiation conducted in positioning rather than words, and I intend to negotiate from a stronger position than they anticipate." Chegwidden appeared on the bridge from the turbolift, Rab and Mackenzie behind him, all 3 in the particular state of people who had been working at full capacity for 4 hours, and had set that fatigue aside because the situation required it. Mackenzie carried a data module, the compiled evidence package, encrypted and redundantly stored across 6 separate systems throughout the ship, because she had anticipated exactly this moment and prepared for it accordingly. How long before they're in optimal containment position? Chegwidden asked. 11 minutes, Seven said. We will use them. She opened the ship-wide comm. This is the captain. All senior staff, this is not a drill. We are being approached by Republic military vessels in a containment formation. Our defensive shields are fully raised. I want to be clear about our posture. We do not fire first. We do not escalate, but we do not yield. Live long and prosper. She closed the comm and turned to B4. Open a channel to the Chancellor's office. B4 complied. Palpatine appeared on the view screen within seconds, which confirmed, as Seven had expected, that he had been waiting for the call. He was composed, as always, his expression arranged into something that functioned as concern, but that Seven's threat assessment identified as performance. Captain 7 of 9, he said warmly. I understand there may be some confusion about the military units I've dispatched. Purely precautionary, I assure you. Given the tragic events at the Jedi Temple, the security situation, Chancellor, Seven said, I will save us both time. We know what the military units are for. We know what the temple bombing was for. We know about the encoded orders transmitted from your personal communications terminal to clone battalion command frequencies in the hours preceding the attack. We know about Order 66. She paused one precise beat. And in approximately 3 hours, the Galactic Senate will know all of it as well. The warmth drained from Palpatine's expression with a speed that confirmed everything. What replaced it was not anger. It was something far more instructive. It was the expression of a man recalculating, rapidly, the landscape of a situation that had just changed in ways he had not anticipated. Seven watched him perform the calculation and noted with clinical precision that he was very fast, faster than most, and that the recalculation produced not panic, but a different kind of strategy. You are making a significant error, he said quietly. The avuncular warmth was entirely gone now. What remained was something older and considerably more dangerous. You do not understand this galaxy, its history, its requirements. What I am doing is necessary, not for power, Captain, but for order, for survival. The Republic is dying. It has been dying for decades. What I am building in its place will last for 1,000 years. I have heard that argument before, Seven said, from the Borg Collective. They also believed that assimilation served a greater good, that individual loss was acceptable in service of systemic perfection. She held his gaze across the transmission. I was Borg, Chancellor. I understand the seduction of that logic better than most. And I am telling you with complete certainty that it is wrong. Palpatine looked at her for a long moment. Then, very deliberately, he closed the channel. He's going to move faster now, Rab said. Yes, Seven agreed. Which means we move faster. She turned to Mackenzie. The evidence package. Ready? Mackenzie said. But Seven, the Senate, we can't simply transmit to them. Palpatine controls the building's communication architecture. Any signal we send through standard channels, he can intercept or block before it reaches the chamber floor. We are not transmitting, Seven said. She looked at Windu, who had come to the bridge during the exchange with Palpatine and now stood near the tactical station with the particular stillness of a man who had just watched a performance he had long suspected was a performance, and found the confirmation both vindicating and devastating. Master Windu, Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan, is he someone who can be trusted? Windu's eyes sharpened. Organa has had concerns about the Chancellor's consolidation of power for years. He has been careful, too careful perhaps, because he lacked evidence. Yes, he can be trusted. Can you reach him directly? Not through Republic communication infrastructure, through Jedi channels. Windu studied her. Yes. Then do so. Tell him that Colonel Mackenzie will be presenting evidence of treason and conspiracy to the Senate in 3 hours, and that he needs to ensure the chamber is convened and secured before we arrive. We will handle our own transportation. She paused. Tell him to invite every senator he trusts personally. Not officially, personally. Windu moved to a secondary console and began composing the communication with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, and intended to use it precisely. On the view screen, the clone gunships had completed their encirclement. Their weapons were still cold. They were waiting for orders. Seven turned to her tactical officer. The two destroyers, their shield modulation frequencies. Identified, Captain. If they raise weapons, I want a precise, low-yield phaser pulse to their shield emitter arrays only. Enough to degrade their targeting systems. Not enough to cause casualties. She paused. We are not at war with the clone troopers aboard those ships. They are following orders they were programmed to follow before they were born. That is not a crime for which I am willing to make them pay. Chegwidden looked at her with an expression Rab recognized. The expression of someone reassessing a person upward in real time. Understood, Captain. Ahsoka, standing at the bridge's rear, spoke quietly. There's something else. If we go to the Senate, if we present this evidence publicly, Palpatine will know he's out of time. He'll accelerate Order 66. The Jedi across the galaxy. I know, Seven said. We can't stop all of it. No, Seven agreed. The word landed without softening, because softening it would have been a dishonesty she did not practice. We cannot stop all of it. We can stop enough of it to matter. She turned to face the view screen, the encircling gunships, the vast luminous face of Coruscant below, a trillion lives balanced on the next 3 hours. B4. Begin transmitting our complete sensor record, encrypted, to the following coordinates. She read out a string of subspace relay points she had identified as independent of Republic infrastructure. Redundant transmission. 7 copies. Different routing for each. Transmitting, B4 said. What are those coordinates? Rab asked. Seven turned to look at him with the precise calm of someone who had thought several moves beyond the current position. Insurance, she said. If we fail in the Senate, the evidence still exists. Somewhere in this galaxy, someone will eventually find it and know what happened here. She paused. The truth does not require our survival to endure. It only requires that we ensure it cannot be entirely erased. The bridge was quiet for a moment. The hum of the ship, the distant cycling of shields at maximum, the soft sound of B4 completing his transmission with careful, methodical certainty. Then Chegwidden straightened to his full height, smoothed his uniform, and said with the simple authority of a man who had spent 30 years making the law mean something in the places where it was hardest to make it mean anything. Then let's go make it matter in person. The Senate chamber was the most impressive room Rab had ever stood in, and he had stood in the chambers of the United States Supreme Court, the Hague, and the wardroom of a nuclear carrier during a full battle group deployment. It rose in concentric tiers of repulsor lift platforms, each carrying a senatorial delegation from worlds Rab had no reference for, the geometry of democratic representation rendered in durasteel and light, on a scale that made human legislative architecture feel provisional by comparison. Senator Bail Organa had done his work in the 3 hours available to him. The chamber was 2/3 full, which by Senate standards constituted an extraordinary emergency convening, and the quality of the attendance was notable. These were not the senators who voted with the chancellor reflexively. These were the ones who had been watching, and worrying, and waiting for something they could point to. Mackenzie walked to the presentation platform at the chamber's center with the particular bearing she brought to every courtroom. Not aggressive, not deferential, the precise professional confidence of someone who had done the work and was ready to show it. Rab took position at the platform's edge. Chegwidden stood behind her, the weight of his presence a deliberate statement. This was not a junior officer making allegations. This was a senior military legal authority, presenting evidence under the full institutional gravity of his office. Ahsoka stood with Windu and the surviving council members in the Jedi delegation platform, visible, intentional, her presence a living rebuttal to the official narrative. Seven had remained aboard the Enterprise G. The clone gunships were still in position. Someone needed to be between them and the chamber. The Senate Speaker called for order with the particular exhausted authority of someone managing a situation well outside normal parameters, and Mackenzie stepped forward and began. She was extraordinary at this. Rab had watched her try cases for 15 years, and he had never fully habituated to the experience of watching Mackenzie present evidence to a hostile audience. The way she built it, layer by patient layer, never asking the audience to make a leap she hadn't already bridged for them, never presenting a conclusion before the foundation was so thoroughly established that the conclusion became the only logical destination. She presented the sensor data first, the pre-positioned emergency units, the timeline of the explosion, the ordnance signatures. She presented it in terms that the universal translator rendered clearly enough that the scientific specifics were accessible without being overwhelming. She presented B4's communications routing analysis with a full explanation of his methodology, his certification standards, his 91.7% certainty, and then she made the point that Rab had watched her make in dozens of cases when the evidence was strong, but not absolute. 91.7% certainty, she said to the chamber, her voice carrying to the upper tiers without strain, is not the same as absolute certainty. I want to be precise about that. What it means is that the probability of an alternative explanation, one that does not implicate the Chancellor's personal communications terminal as the origin point of these orders, is less than 9%. In Federation judicial proceedings, that threshold constitutes sufficient grounds for formal investigation and the issuance of emergency injunctive relief. She paused, letting the chamber absorb it. We are not asking you to convict. We are asking you to look. She presented the detention facility audio. The prisoner's voice came through the chamber's acoustic system, small, exhausted, speaking to an empty cell, and Rab watched the effect move through the senatorial platforms like a wave. Not outrage, not yet. Something quieter and more durable. The specific discomfort of people who had been telling themselves a story about their government and had just heard evidence that the story had a different ending. She presented the Order 66 communications pattern last. The full scope of it, clone units across dozens of systems, the timing, the routing, the galaxy-wide operational posture that pointed toward a single coordinated command. She mapped it on the chamber's central holographic display so that every senator could see the geometry of what had been prepared without their knowledge or consent, and she said, very simply, this is not a security measure. This is not a response to the separatist threat. This was built to be used against the people in this room's constituents, against the Jedi Order, and against the Republic itself. The only question before you is whether you will look at what we have presented and act on it, or whether you will allow the man who built this to finish what he started. The chamber erupted, not into violence, into the particular controlled chaos of 800 legislative platforms, all attempting to speak simultaneously, while the speaker fought for order, and Organa worked the chamber's communication system with focused urgency, reaching his allies, holding his coalition together against the immediate counterpressure that Rab could see beginning in the Chancellor's box, where Palpatine's aides were moving quickly, transmitting, working their own networks with the practiced efficiency of people who had been managing the Senate's political architecture for decades. And then Palpatine himself appeared, not via transmission, in person, which meant he had been in the building, which meant he had anticipated this and positioned himself accordingly, and Rab filed that information in the part of his mind that tracked tactical variables, because it meant the Chancellor had not come to yield. He came to the speaker's platform with the measured pace of a man who had never in his life moved in a way that suggested hurry, and the chamber quieted around him with the reflexive deference of an institution that had given one man too much of its authority for too long. And Rab watched Mackenzie watch him with the specific focused attention she gave to hostile witnesses she had been waiting to cross-examine. "Senators," Palpatine said, his voice filling the chamber with the same careful instrument quality that 7 sensors had been analyzing since first contact. "I understand the concern that has brought you here today. The evidence presented by our visitors is sophisticated, compelling even to those unfamiliar with the complexities of wartime intelligence operations." He paused, turning slowly, encompassing the entire chamber in his gaze. "But I must tell you what these visitors cannot, what they do not know. This republic faces an existential threat, not merely from the separatists, but from within the Jedi Order itself. The evidence you have seen has been selectively presented, manipulated. These beings arrived in our system through unknown means, with unknown allegiances, and they have chosen to align themselves with a faction that has Chancellor." The voice came from the Jedi platform. "Not Windu, Ahsoka." She stepped forward to the platform's edge, and the chamber looked at her, and Rab watched Palpatine's composure perform a microscopic adjustment that no one without training would have noticed. "My name is Ahsoka Tano," she said. "I was a Jedi Padawan. I was expelled from the Order and put on trial for a bombing I did not commit. The actual perpetrator, before she died, told me she had been manipulated by someone inside the Republic, someone who needed the Jedi destabilized, someone who needed a pretext. She looked directly at Palpatine across the chamber. I have spent weeks trying to understand who that someone was. And then a ship appeared in orbit with sensor data that I could not have manufactured, recorded by people who arrived in this system 18 hours ago and have no stake in your political structures, your war, or your chancellor's ambitions. She paused. They have nothing to gain from lying. He has everything to gain from you believing that they are. The chamber erupted again, louder this time. And then Seven's voice came through every communication system in the building simultaneously, through the chamber's speakers, through personal comm devices, through the building's public address infrastructure, because B4 had spent the last 3 hours quietly mapping the Senate building's communication architecture, and Seven had been waiting for exactly this moment. Senators of the Galactic Republic, Seven said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had once spoken for the Borg Collective and had learned from that experience exactly how to make words feel inevitable. My name is 7 of 9. I am the captain of the USS Enterprise G. I arrived in your system without agenda, without alliance, and without the capacity to manufacture the evidence that Colonel Mackenzie has presented to you today. That evidence was recorded by my ship's sensors in real time. It is cryptographically authenticated. It cannot be altered retroactively. And copies of it exist in 7 independent locations beyond the reach of anyone in this building. A pause. What you choose to do with it is your decision. It has always been your decision. That is what a republic means. I am simply ensuring that the decision is made with full knowledge of what has been done in your name. Palpatine turned toward the chamber's communication system with an expression that had finally, completely, abandoned its performance of warmth. What looked out from his face now was something very old and very cold, and entirely uninterested in pretense. He raised his hands. The lightning came from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, cascading from his fingers in a torrent of dark energy that the Enterprise G's sensors, still recording, would later classify as an energy discharge of entirely unknown physics, and the chamber exploded into genuine chaos as senators fled their platforms and security personnel scrambled, and Windu ignited his lightsaber and moved with a speed that made Rab's fighter pilot reflexes feel pedestrian by comparison. Mackenzie was already moving, not toward the fight, toward the evidence module, because she had her priorities in the precise order they needed to be in, and the evidence was more important than her position in the room. Chegwidden put himself between her and the nearest threat with the physical authority of a man who had been a Navy SEAL before he was a lawyer and had never entirely stopped being one. Rab drew his phaser. He set it to maximum stun, which against an opponent generating that kind of energy discharge might accomplish nothing, but which was the right setting nonetheless, because his standing orders were clear, and Seven had been right about the orders being right. He fired twice, not at Palpatine, who was engaged with Windu and operating at a level that Rab's phaser was not calibrated for, but at the 2 Senate security personnel who were moving toward Ahsoka with weapons drawn, responding to standing orders that identified her as a threat. They dropped cleanly. Ahsoka looked at him across the chaos of the chamber. "Nice shot," she said. "I've had practice," Rab said. His comm badge activated. Seven's voice, precise and immediate beneath the noise. "Commander Rab, I am reading weapons discharge in the chamber. Report." "Palpatine has revealed himself," Rab said, watching Windu drive the Chancellor back toward the speaker's platform with the controlled fury of a man who had been right about something terrible for a very long time and found no satisfaction in it. "It's on your sensors." "It is," Seven said. "I am transmitting the live feed to every independent news network in the system simultaneously. B4 identified 17 that operate outside Republic government infrastructure. The revelation is being recorded and broadcast in real time." A pause. "The clone gunships outside have received new orders. They are moving to attack this ship." Rab looked at the ceiling as though he could see through it to the orbital battle he could not help with from the Senate floor. "Can you hold them?" "Yes," Seven said, with the simple certainty of someone who had faced the Borg Collective and found it insufficient. "Handle what you can handle, Commander. I will handle what I can handle." The battle in the Senate chamber lasted 11 minutes. Rab knew this precisely because he timed it. Old aviator habit. The instinct to know exactly how long you had been in the envelope. How much had passed? How much remained? 11 minutes from Palpatine's first lightning strike to the moment the Chancellor retreated through the Speaker's private exit with 2 of his personal guard, pursued by Windu and 2 other council members, who moved through the chaos of the evacuating chamber with a speed and purpose that made the crowd part for them like water around a hull. 11 minutes in which Mackenzie kept the evidence module against her body, and Chegwidden kept himself between her and every threat that presented itself, and Rab worked the perimeter with his phaser on stun, neutralizing Senate security personnel who were following standing orders they had no reason yet to question. Ahsoka fought differently from anyone Rab had ever watched fight. Not the contained, technical violence of military training, but something more fluid and anticipatory, as though she processed the movement of threats slightly ahead of when they occurred. She had produced 2 lightsabers from somewhere in her robes, white-bladed, and she used them with a precision that was almost architectural, every movement serving a structural purpose, clearing space, redirecting force, protecting the people around her, without ever quite looking like that was what she was doing. Rab watched her work and filed it in the part of his mind that recognized excellence in physical domains regardless of context. When the chamber quieted, the senators evacuated, the security personnel either stunned or standing down in the confusion. The holographic displays still cycling through Mackenzie's evidence on automatic loop, because B4 had set them that way from orbit, and no one had thought to turn them off. Organa appeared from the upper-tier access corridor with 4 other senators, whose expressions carried the specific quality of people who had just watched their understanding of their government restructure itself entirely, and were already thinking about what came next. "The evidence," Organa said to Mackenzie, and it was not a request. "Secured," Mackenzie said. 7 copies, independently stored, cryptographically authenticated. You cannot alter it retroactively, and neither can anyone else. She handed him a copy of the data module. "Senator, what you do with this is your decision. But I would suggest that the next 6 hours are the most important 6 hours in your Republic's history, and I would suggest that you spend them ensuring that every senator in this building has seen this evidence before Palpatine has the opportunity to reframe what happened in this chamber today." Organa looked at her with the focused gravity of a man receiving an extraordinary responsibility and feeling its weight precisely. "He'll declare martial law," he said, "the moment he reconsolidates. Then you have less than 6 hours, Chegwidden said. He was not unkind about it. He was simply precise, which Rab had always found to be Chegwidden's particular form of kindness, giving people the truth of their situation without decorating it, because decorated truth was less useful than plain truth when the decisions were consequential. Aboard the Enterprise G7 fought a different battle with the same economy. The 6 clone gunships had moved to attack formation when the Senate Chamber's events began registering on Republic command channels, and the 2 destroyers had followed their lead, weapons now armed and targeting solutions locked on the Enterprise G's primary systems. 7 had noted their approach vectors, their shield modulation frequencies, their weapons cycling patterns, and she had done what she always did when presented with a tactical situation. She had found the most efficient path to the desired outcome and pursued it without ornamentation. She did not want to destroy those ships. She had been precise about that from the beginning. The clone troopers aboard them were following programming installed before their birth, orders that overrode their capacity for independent judgment, and 7 understood that condition with a clarity that came from having once been its equivalent, a being whose choices had been made by something larger than herself, who had learned that the beings inside the collective were not the enemy simply because the collective used them as weapons. She disabled them instead. 4 precisely modulated phaser pulses to shield emitter arrays, the same low-yield targeting solution she had ordered prepared hours earlier, degraded the destroyer's targeting systems to the point of combat ineffectiveness without breaching their hulls. The gunships she handled with a rotating shield modulation cycle that made their weapons simply stop working against her hull, while B4 transmitted a direct communication to each vessel's command frequency. Calm and clear, and entirely without threat. "Your weapons are ineffective against our shielding. We have not returned fire. We will not return fire. We are asking you to stand down. What is happening in the Senate chamber is being transmitted to every independent news network in this system. We recommend you observe it before following further orders. 3 of the 6 gunships stood down within 4 minutes. The other 3 required a second phaser pulse each to their propulsion arrays, enough to hold them in place, not enough to damage them. By the time Rab's voice came up from the Senate floor reporting that Palpatine had retreated and the chamber was secured, the orbital situation had resolved into a tense but static geometry. 12 Republic vessels holding position around the Enterprise G, none firing, all of them receiving the same independent news broadcast that B4 was routing through every available channel in the Coruscant system. The truth, Seven had found, was most effective when it was simply made impossible to avoid. She was at the transporter room when her team returned from the surface. Chegwin first, then Mackenzie, then Rab, then Ahsoka, who materialized last and stood for a moment in the familiar shimmer of the transporter beam's dissipation, looking at the plain bulkheads of the Enterprise G's interior as though measuring the distance between where she had been and where she now was. "Palpatine?" Seven asked. "Retreated," Rab said. "Windu is in pursuit. The council members who survived the temple attack are moving to secure whatever they can secure." He paused. "It's not over." "No," Seven agreed. "It is not." She had known this from the beginning. The evidence had been presented, the revelation had been broadcast. The Senate had witnessed what it needed to witness, but the structures that Palpatine had built over years of careful, patient work were not dismantled in 11 minutes in a legislative chamber. Order 66 was in the clone programming. The Separatist war was still ongoing. The galaxy was a system in crisis that a 3-hour Senate presentation and 7 copies of sensor data could not fully resolve. What it could do, what Seven had determined from the moment B4 first flagged the communications pattern, was ensure that the truth existed in a form that could not be erased. That when the history of this moment was written, the record would contain an independent account. That the conspiracy would not succeed in the clean, total, unopposed fashion that its architect had designed. That was not everything. It was not nothing. Ahsoka sat down on the transporter pad with the particular bonelessness of someone whose body had finally presented the bill for several days of continuous operation. "The Jedi across the galaxy," she said. "The ones in the field. If Order 66 goes out, we are transmitting," B4 said from the corridor. He had been listening, which was a habit Seven had come to appreciate about him. His understanding that information was most useful when shared with the people who needed it, rather than held until asked. "I have been transmitting a warning signal on Jedi communication frequencies for the last 40 minutes. Every Jedi in range of a hyperspace relay will receive it. The message is simple. I wrote it myself." He paused, with the particular quality of someone uncertain whether their work is adequate. "I said, Order 66 is coming. It comes from the Chancellor. Do not trust your clone units. Survive if you can. The truth has been recorded. You are not alone." The transporter room was quiet. Rab looked at B4 for a long moment. "That's a good message," he said. B4 considered this with his characteristic deliberateness. "Commander Data would have written it better," he said. "But I believe he would have approved of the intention." Mackenzie set the evidence module down on the transporter console and looked at it. The physical object, small and unremarkable, containing everything they had built in the last 18 hours. "What happens now?" she asked. Not helplessly. She was not a person who did things helplessly, but with the genuine uncertainty of someone who had completed the work they knew how to do and was standing at the edge of what came next. Seven looked at her. At Chegwin, who was watching her with the steady attention of a man who trusted her judgment and wanted to see what it produced. At Rab, who was watching Ahsoka. At Ahsoka, who was looking at the floor with the focused inward quality of someone taking inventory of what remained. "Now," Seven said, "we find out what this galaxy does with the truth we gave it." The Enterprise D remained in orbit above Coruscant for 6 more days. In that time, the Galactic Senate convened 4 emergency sessions. Bail Organa presented Mackenzie's evidence package to a full chamber on the 2nd day, with independent verification from 3 Coruscant-based scientific institutions, whose analysts confirmed the sensor data's authenticity and the communications routing analysis's conclusions. The vote to suspend Chancellor Palpatine's emergency powers pending formal investigation passed by a margin that surprised even Organa, not because the senators had become courageous overnight, but because Seven's broadcast had made it impossible for them to claim, in the historical record, that they had not known. Palpatine was not immediately captured. Seven had not expected him to be. A man who had spent decades constructing a conspiracy of that magnitude did not run out of options, simply because the conspiracy had been exposed. He ran toward different options, deeper contingencies, the resources of a darkness that predated the Republic itself. Windu's pursuit ended inconclusively in the lower levels of the Senate District, a fact that settled into the ship's crew with the particular weight of an unresolved case file. Order 66 went out regardless. On the third day, and the warning B4 had transmitted saved some Jedi. Not all, not most, but some. And in the mathematics of catastrophe, some was a number that mattered. Ahsoka Tano remained aboard the Enterprise G for all 6 days, and on the morning of the 7th she came to Seven's ready room and sat across the desk from her, and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing something they have been carrying for a long time, into a form that can be given to another person. "You didn't save the Republic," she said. "Not as an accusation." "No," Seven agreed, "but you changed what happens to it." Ahsoka looked at her hands. The senators who voted to investigate, they exist now as a matter of record. The Jedi who survived because of B4's warning, they're out there somewhere. The truth you broadcast, she paused, it doesn't disappear. Even if Palpatine wins in the short term, what you recorded, what you presented, what you transmitted, it exists. People know. "Yes," Seven said. "That was the objective." Ahsoka looked up. Was it enough? Seven considered the question with the care it deserved, which was the only way she considered questions that mattered. Outside the ready room viewport, Coruscant turned in the light of its sun. Vast, damaged, still luminous, still holding its trillion lives in the lattice of its perpetual city. A civilization in crisis, which was different from a civilization ending, and the difference was not nothing. "It is what was possible," Seven said finally. "Enough is a standard that requires a complete outcome to measure against. We do not yet have the complete outcome. What we have is a record that cannot be erased, a warning that reached people who needed it, and a Senate that will find it considerably more difficult to pretend ignorance than it would have without us." She paused. "In my experience, that is what justice looks like in practice. Not a verdict, a shift in what is possible." Ahsoka held her gaze for a long moment, and then nodded. Once, with the specific quality of someone accepting a truth that is harder than the one they hoped for, and more durable than the one they feared. When the Enterprise D finally broke orbit, B4 stood at his science station and watched Coruscant diminish in the aft sensors with an expression that Seven did not have a precise classification for, something between completion and the particular wistfulness of someone who had written a message into the dark and could not know who received it, or when, or what they did with it. The subspace rift that returned them to Federation space opened with the same improbable precision as the one that had brought them here, as though the geometry of chance had briefly aligned into something that resembled intention. Seven recorded the return coordinates, flagged the event for Starfleet science, and sat in her command chair as the stars of their own galaxy resolved on the view screen. Familiar, mapped, home in the way that a place is home when you have been somewhere that reminded you what home means. Chegwin appeared at her shoulder. "You know," he said, "in 30 years of JAG work, I have never concluded a case without knowing the verdict." "You know the evidence," Seven said. "The verdict belongs to them." He was quiet for a moment. "Think they'll get it right?" Seven looked at the stars. She thought of a trillion lives compressed into light and architecture, of an ancient being who had felt B4 in the Force and revised something he had believed for 900 years, of a young woman with white-bladed lightsabers sitting on a transporter pad taking inventory of what remained, of a message transmitted into hyperspace relay networks that said, "You are not alone." "I think," Seven said carefully, "that they now have a better chance than they did." It was not a triumphant answer. It was an honest one. In 7 of 9's experience, those were rarely the same thing, and the honest one was always more useful. The Enterprise G jumped to warp, and the stars became light, and behind them a galaxy turned slowly toward whatever it was going to become. Somewhere in its darkness, the truth was still broadcasting.